And then the last sort of these broad things to watch, though there are many, is how nominations, campaigning, and elections proceed with what seems truly a true coalition system. Remember, Pakatan formed after the elections last time. We had an electoral pact. We've had coalitions before and after the elections among the opposition. But this is more solid. I would argue that we have actually reached a two-party system in Malaysia. And you see this in the extent to which the BN is making more of an effort. The promises in its platform, as in the opposition's platform, Pakatan's platform, may be a bit of a stretch. And the current level of BRIM handouts do seem probably unsustainable, however much they're promised indefinitely now. The BN, though, is taking a real risk in bruising feelings to shuffle its candidates around, to introduce 80% new faces in Selangor, for instance. Almost half of its candidates overall, I think 50% state, 30% federal, are new faces. But Pakatan, like BN, is feeling the pain of sharing out the seats, figuring out what needs to be done. I think both sides are putting in more of an effort than if this were a sure thing. All right, so the second thing I'll talk about, just again briefly, is the argument for a move to a two-coalition system, historically in Malaysia, has been that it will move politics toward a discussion of the issues, away from just race, away from just handouts, and more toward discussing actual policies. That's happening a bit, but it's still mixed with the same old communalism as ever. So for instance, I went to a Pakatan trauma last weekend in which, yes, there were arguments. It was Siva Rasa Rasia, Nurul Isa, and Ambiga, speaking for Bersih, saying that she would speak on any side, along with various people from Hindra, from Lembah Pantai, from Nurul's campaign headquarters, and so forth. But it was targeted at Indian voters. It was, to mark the New Year's and so forth. And so there was an interesting mix of broad policy, broad, big issue, programmatic speeches, and why the Indian community needs to do X. Okay, arguing that the Indian community needs to do X because of being Indian is a communal appeal. Okay, those appeals may dovetail, but the fact that they're still expressed in terms of a communal identity suggests the ways in which that sort of politics lives. And I don't think it'll go away anytime soon in Malaysia. All right, with so many new candidates, though, we could expect that both, especially in the BN, but also in Pakatan, these campaigns should be less about personalities, less about charisma than about parties. That's probably a good thing. So for instance, my own sense is that if somebody like Ibrahim Ali were to contest, which he will as an independent probably, it sends a good signal about diminishing the type of racial appeals that UMNO is making. Not that they're not making racial appeals, but diminishing the timbre, changing the timbre of those. Not to have him, particularly him. Others from Perkasa are there, but not him, as a standard bearer for UMNO. Okay, sorry if my own preferences emerge here. Okay, but the politics of race emerge too in who's excluded, and it's never entirely sure how truly voluntary this is. So for instance, the exclusion of all these MCA leaders, including government ministers, Wasolek, Hong Ka-ting, Gan Peng-siu, Nguyen Yen, and so forth, does acknowledge the fact that the MCA is not really pulling its weight in bringing the Chinese community back to the BN. Although there are also heavyweights from UMNO, Rai Satim, Shahrizad, Said Hamid Albar, and others who are kind of the detritus of 2008 who are also out of the picture now. Okay? On the other hand, the shuffling of not new people, of established candidates among constituencies in both coalitions. So the idea, for instance, moving Charles Hector from DAP away from Klang, including those with a strong record of constituency service, diminishes accountability, which is the main claim for majoritarian instead of proportional representation voting, is that you know your MP and that person is accountable. So that sort of reshuffling may do more for party strengthening, to encourage people to vote for a brand rather than a specific carrier of that brand than anything else. Okay? In terms of issues, public opinion polling suggests that corruption, especially Merdeka Center surveys, is the #1 issue among Malaysian voters, their #1 priority, followed by the cost of living. But we can't separate these two things out. There's double-digit poverty, over 19% in Sabah, for instance. It's a poorest state with the second poorest growth rate. When it entered the Union in 1967, it was the second richest. Actually, as of the early 70s, it was the second richest after Selangor. So we can't separate, 1963, We can't separate out the poverty in Sabah from either development policies, oil revenues, and that sort of thing, or from the misuse of resources and endemic corruption. So we see this with the corruption investigations of people like Musa Amin, but also the recent Global Witness expose of Taib in Sarawak, for instance. The concern over the cost of living on the peninsula as well, the impossibility of owning one's own home as a recent university graduate, cost of education, other concerns. These are both standalone concerns and interconnected with concerns over cronyism, the misuse of public funds, major scandals, and so forth. Another core issue that also ties in with this corruption focus has to do with electoral reform. All right? If the Pakatan loses overall, or even if it just loses some of the seats it now holds, because of these concerns of the electoral rolls, we risk serious disillusionment and disenfranchisement among some of those new voters and among current critics. We can expect calls for annulments or recounts. One other issue, which apparently has about 5% support as the #1 priority, tipped off by issues like Linus, but also deforestation and so forth, is the environment. A focus on environmental politics is a focus on issue-based politics as opposed to communal or other politics. And that's tied in with development concerns, corruption concerns, and so forth. All right, lastly, I'll just touch on the role of civil society amongst all this. All right. Social organizations and popular mobilization both play a role. So there's mass mobilization, but there are also increasingly professionalized social movement organizations. We have mass efforts at systematic or systemic and programmatic as well as policy-specific reforms. So Bersih had specific policy recommendations. It's a mass movement, but it's also one that gives policy expertise. We have Himpunan Hijau, that similarly is a mass movement that also has specific policy implications. We have the Idle No More movement in Sabah to try to take action. These are all mass campaigns that are trying to change specific things. We have different types of efforts that span beyond the electoral cycle itself. So for instance, Pusat Komas's Freedom Film Fest has really increased efforts at documentation of a host of different issues, of getting people to go out and be citizen journalists in terms of documentary filmmaking, and then having a festival to show these. We have groups like Lawyer Buruk, of professionals, lawyers, using their skills to intercede in policy matters in providing expertise. We have the more election-focused Undi Info. Again, a volunteer effort to try to increase information, make it easier to find out who's running and what. All this stuff that you could get from the SPR website, the Election Commission website, but it's never very easy to get. It's much more user-friendly, okay? And all of these sorts of things have kept awareness alive and kicking, but they're also working to document what's going on. There are groups like the Malaysia Forum. There was a Malaysia Forum in Singapore. There was one simultaneously in KL. And then there were two on the same day, different time zones, in California and Massachusetts in the US. And they all teleconferenced together and so forth. All of those things suggest the ways in which Malaysians overseas are also increasingly being tied in. The diaspora is being used not just for boomerang activism, for feeding back toward the Malaysian government, but really in ways of trying to engage Malaysians, to make them be aware, whether from the BN side or from the Pakatan side or whether uncommitted, just to take a role and hopefully come back to Malaysia. That suggests a longer-term mobilization. Most key, perhaps, for these elections themselves, though, are the rash of election monitoring, watching, and advocacy organizations, which overlap with these sort of broader civil societal initiatives. So we have Bersih and its Pemantau Pilihan Raya Rakyat, this Jom Pantau campaign, the monitoring campaign. We have the National Institute for Electoral Integrity and the Merdeka Center collaborating in this project, creating a robust and transparent electoral process in Malaysia. We have the Info Pilihan Raya Malaysia, which is a Committee for Independent Journalism, the National Institute for Democracy and Electoral Integrity, and the Merdeka Center with funding from the Asia Foundation. This is a coordinated effort with a website, with Twitter feeds, with mobilization of observers, with news feeds, and so forth. There are Facebook pages to crowdsource images of things that seem dubious. There are multiple venues in which one can submit complaints or reports of things that look like they need investigation. And there's the official Pemerhati, the official observers group of groups that have been chosen seemingly because they have nothing to do with election observation, but that's okay, they're learning. So that's the Center for Public Policy Studies, IDEAS, the Malaysian Confederation of the Disabled, and the Merdeka Center are the ones that have hung on and remained with that. There are questions as to whether they can get enough volunteers, but these will be well-watched and well-documented elections. And lastly, there are media. Okay, we have the news media, the Malaysia Kini, Malaysia Insider, and so on, even if online media can't get to the end press conferences. We have radio stations like Radio Free Sarawak. More official channels like BFM have been told to exercise restraint, but they're also pushing the envelope a bit, it seems. We have webcasting on web TV, so we have Ubah TV, Kini TV, live-streamed forums, and so forth. And we have social media. Half of all Malaysians are on Facebook. Right, that's an extraordinary percentage. And while, yes, there's a digital divide in Malaysia, but 90% of youths are online, and 60% of Malaysians overall are online. And those numbers tend to undercount because of handphone access, for instance, or sharing of materials. The opposition still seems to have the advantage online, but there are all sorts of high-profile efforts now that are not necessarily interactive. They're not about creating blog posts or creating forums where people can necessarily interact, but also to create networks through which information can be systematically disseminated. Okay? There are also media monitoring efforts. So this is poll watching in a larger frame. There's the Watching the Watchdog group that CIJ and University of Nottingham in Malaysia have put together. So they're evaluating basically all online and free-to-air TV, media, print media, and so forth, from the dissolution of Parliament until shortly after the polls. They're linking up with cognate efforts in the Philippines and elsewhere. I'm part of another project that's trying to trace networks through not just on the ground, but also social media. So we tend to think of Malaysia as fundamentally a state of strong parties. But these new networks organizing through media channels and through social media in particular suggest a new way to think about political mobilization, mobilization to vote, but also to remain engaged. This could be a longer-term trend. So overall, it's an exceedingly important election, even more than those other exceedingly important elections. I urge any observers to look beyond the breaking news. It's not just who's in, who's out, what's the slander today, or what plaudits, or what handouts, but what are the broader trends represented? There's a genie out of the bottle, this seemingly irrepressible engagement around the quality of elections, sustained now at an active level at least since PRU13 started in 2007, suggests a real and widespread concern for the quality of democracy, not just specific leaders, but what it means to be a democracy. There's a demonstrable shift in the how and what of news flows, despite the mainstream media's sadly desperate attempts to toe the BN party line for all they're worth, that suggest a mass public that simply can't be manipulated in the same ways as before. Not that this public, unlike all other publics, can't be manipulated at all, but doing so demands different tools and perhaps real accountability. So the rash of new faces and new messages by all sides in this contest, and the staggering expense, for instance, expanse of advertising, as well as a burgeoning public opinion polling industry, suggest a new level of political competition, for better and for worse. And the results, as well, could be genuinely interesting.